Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching how Eastern Rome established cultural supremacy over Eastern Europe by kings and generals. So I just thought that this title sounded very interesting. We've seen a couple of kings and generals videos on the Eastern Roman Empire. Also, I am interested in sort of soft power, how culture spreads, how culture is developed, how things like culture can give one state control over another. And it seems like that's sort of the direction this video is going in, so I thought it sounded very interesting. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below and has exclusive content, and subscribe to the channel. Anyway, without any further ado, let's get into this reaction.
But does the rain not fall equally upon all peoples? Does the sun not shine for all? And do we not all breathe the air in equal measure? Wherefore then are you not ashamed to recognize but 3 tongues, and command the other nations and races to be blind and deaf? These are the words that Constantine of Thessaloniki used against his Constantinopolitan detractors to defend the use of Old Church Slavonic, the language used to proselytize against the Slavs of Moravia. His Christianization work would signal the beginning of what is perhaps Byzantium's most enduring cultural and diplomatic legacy, the Byzantine Commonwealth. This was an extensive network of diplomatic, monastic, and cultural exchange, which saw the Eastern Roman Empire export its culture and religion across vast swaths of Eastern Europe and the Caucasus.
I mean, there are a lot of ways to establish power over those around you, or even, countries and peoples that are far away. I mean, of course, there's hard power, like military power, but there's also soft power. What we're talking about here, there's, spreading your culture, which can be many things, your media, your food. Of course, America is sort of the master in the modern age of soft power. Which I think, something I'll think will be particularly relevant in this one. There's, of course, spreading your religion. The Eastern Roman Empire was, the state of Eastern Orthodoxy, at least until it collapsed. And so, of course, there was the split between Eastern and Western Christianity, but that was a big part, I would imagine, of Eastern Rome's soft power. There's, diplomacy, there's political diplomacy, there's trade deals. Byzantium had a lot of money, they had a lot of trade going on. So there's a lot of different ways to expand your power over large areas of territory, and I'm very curious to see what exactly we get into in this video.
A legacy that still exists in many countries in those regions today.
Yeah, I mean, look at throughout sort of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, Eastern Europe, that area, the spread of Orthodox Christianity. I mean, Russia, Orthodox Christianity is a massive part of their culture. And so if you just look at that alone, that is a big part of the Byzantine legacy.
Welcome to our video on the Byzantine Commonwealth, its long life and enduring legacy to the modern age. It's all well and good hearing about this, but why not go and see Byzantium for yourself this summer? Knowing some Turkish wouldn't go amiss for a...
Very true. All right, you guys know the deal. Shout out to Kings and Generals. Please go check out their video, which is linked down below. Go check out their sponsor, use their sponsor's link, leave a like on their video, subscribe to their channel, show them some support for making fantastic content that we all enjoy.
A Babbel subscription, and get ready for your adventures right now. The term Byzantine Commonwealth emerged in the 20th century, largely coined by Russian émigré and renowned Byzantist Dmitry Obolensky. Obolensky considered the Commonwealth to be a typical core periphery system, with Constantinople as the dominant power, spreading influence to far outlying regions. Obolensky envisioned a system in which active Byzantine diplomacy allowed for the spread of the empire's cultural soft power. However, other historians, such as Christian Raffensperger, prefer the term Byzantine ideal. In this concept, Christianized states within Eastern Rome's orbit imitated Byzantine notions of kingship and prestige, but were not diplomatically bound to them. An example of this lies in Bulgarian Tsars such as Simeon, who openly aspired to be universal monarchs at the expense of Byzantium, and later Muscovite Tsars, who defied the will of Byzantium in the 14th century. In any case, when it comes to Byzantium's cultural impact on other nations, most scholars focus on the states of Eastern Europe, such as Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, Ukraine, and Russia, whose Eastern Orthodox faith is a direct result of historical contact with Eastern Rome.
Yep. I mean, I mentioned that earlier, but if we're talking about sort of the legacy of the Byzantine Empire, I think Russia is one of the first places you look. That might be surprising to some people. You might think, well, you're not going to look closer to home. Well, the Ottomans took over the territory of the Eastern Roman Empire, and they really did their own thing with it, right? So if you're talking about the legacy of the Byzantines, particularly their religious legacy, I think Russia holds a claim to a lot of that. I mean, there's sort of this idea in the Russian consciousness that you had, the first Rome, which was Rome, and this is both a sort of religious and political idea, an idea of empire. You had the second Rome, which was Constantinople, which was the center of both the Eastern Roman Empire and Orthodox Christianity. And then, they feel that when the Ottomans conquered the city, that, the second Rome of Constantinople fell. And that we came to a third Rome, which was Moscow, the new center of Eastern Orthodoxy, sort of the inheritor of the Roman and Byzantine legacy. This is sort of, like I said, an idea in the Russian consciousness, and that clearly ties into the Byzantine legacy, the Orthodox legacy. So it's all a very interesting way of seeing things, and clearly shows how important Byzantine culture and religion was to a lot of different people over a long stretch of territory.
However, the Byzantine Commonwealth's reach goes beyond that, reaching into Georgia, Orthodox Christians in Anatolia and the Caucasus, as well as Hungary, Bohemia, Moravia, and even Lithuania.
Yeah.
Let us now explore how this Commonwealth worked and examine the cultural and diplomatic networks that emerged from its expansion. The beginnings of what would become the Byzantine Commonwealth emerged in the 9th century CE. During this period, the empire was occupied with many northern wars. Ever since the 6th century CE, Slavic tribes had been descending into the southern Balkans, pushed by nomadic incursions. These tribes had been quite troublesome for the Byzantines, who tried to subdue them by isolating them politically and converting them to Christianity. This had limited success, due in part to the Byzantine policy of forced expulsions to break up Slavic tribal and kinship groups to erode political and cultural unity.
I always think it's interesting that in the grand scheme, well, I think in our modern era, when we think about Eastern Europe and the Balkans, we think about mainly Slavs. Now, there are countries and groups in that area that are not Slavic, but it's predominantly populated by Slavs. Yet, if you look in the grand scheme, the Slavs did not move in that long ago, in the grand scheme of our history. It has not been too long since they arrived. I think that's sort of an interesting thing to think about.
However, while some tribes in modern-day Bulgaria and Serbia embraced the Roman god, there were many relapses into paganism, which the Byzantines considered rather detestable. In 862, major progress in Christianizing the Slavs was made when Prince Rastislav of Moravia requested that evangelist scholars be sent to his realm to convert the people of his kingdom. To that end, Emperor Manuel III required scholars familiar with the culture of the Slavs. The ideal candidates were Cyril and Methodius, two brothers who were both literate and well-learned monks, and had spent a large part of their lives in multicultural Thessaloniki, where many Slavs lived. Ratislav's decision to invite Byzantine monks to his kingdom was politically motivated, as he sought political independence from the Franks, who had assisted in his ascension to power. Indeed, Frankish influence in Moravia was strong, and Cyril and Methodius faced struggles with rival proselytizers, German monastics from nearby Bavaria, who had influence in the region and preferred Latin liturgies.
Exactly. Well, at the time, choosing a religion could be a political decision for a monarch. Oftentimes, if we're talking about Eastern Europe, the choice was between, Eastern Orthodoxy and sort of like Catholicism or Latin Christianity. And we're talking about the split basically between East and West. And so sometimes we would see situations like this where we have both, Orthodox monks or preachers or whatever, Orthodox representatives, and Western Latin representatives kind of battling it out religiously in order to get, this kingdom or this state or this group to adopt their version of Christianity. It's clearly both a religious thing and I think to a certain extent a political thing. If you adopt Orthodox Christianity, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're politically tied to the Byzantine Empire, but in practice, it often did to a certain extent. It often gave you some sort of allegiance to the Byzantines, even if it was not like a set-in-stone alliance. So, yeah, it's definitely a sort of interesting thing to look at.
To compete with this, the two brothers worked to create the Glagolitic alphabet, which they used to translate a large corpus of biblical scripture into Old Church Slavonic, a language much closer to the dialects spoken by the locals than the Latin used by Frankish priests.
Yep.
The Glagolitic alphabet would later be adapted by the Bulgarians to create the Cyrillic alphabet many Slavic nations use today.
Yep, this is where Cyrillic comes from. How about that? That's quite the origin story. Comes from these two Eastern Orthodox monks, basically trying to proselytize and spread their religion in a battle against Western Latin Christianity. Really a fascinating origin story.
In fact, Bulgaria would be one of Byzantium's largest diplomatic victories. When Emperor Boris was trying to break out of the diplomatic isolation born of his kingdom's pagan nature, both the Franks and the Byzantines swept in to compete over who would convert the Bulgarians.
Yep.
Eventually, Boris went with the Eastern Romans, and Bulgaria remains a predominantly Eastern Orthodox nation to this day. A similar pattern can be seen in the 11th century CE, when a Hungarian tribal leader called Gyula II was baptized in Constantinople. While eventually both Hungary and Czech lands became Catholic, they still remained part of the Byzantine commonwealth, both culturally and politically throughout the Middle Ages.
Yeah, well, the Balkans are sort of a good place to see this division between, East and West, if you want to call it that. You have a lot of Orthodox populations in Orthodox countries, but then, particularly towards the western side of the Balkans, you have more Catholics. And a lot of those countries became Catholic, much later than we're talking about right now. But you can still see, and of course, nowadays you have countries like Bosnia and Albania who have, prominent populations of Muslims. So it's a great place to see sort of this split that we have going on. And then, obviously, looking at it in modern times, you see the other influence of the Ottoman Turks, the Muslim Ottoman Turks. So it's really fascinating conglomeration of cultures.
Albeit with less intensity than Serbia, Bulgaria, and Russia. Sending monks or scholars to foreign lands was a staple of Byzantine diplomacy, and in doing so, Byzantine ideas of divinely ordained power and hierarchy were exported to neighboring nations. Byzantine cosmology often linked Neoplatonism with Orthodox Christianity, resulting in the Byzantines being depicted as God's chosen people, akin to the Israelites of the Bible. Byzantine scholars, particularly monastics such as Dionysius the Areopagite or John of Damascus, often legitimize Byzantine cultural supremacy using theology. The empire as a mirror of paradise is a common Byzantine literary theme, and
the Byzantines justify their position at the top, their cultural position at the top, at least how they saw it, through religion, their place in Christianity. Though it's interesting because I do think to some extent this is sort of a continuation of an old Roman trend. The Romans, we're talking about the entire Roman Empire, saw themselves as, supreme. Their culture was at the top. And part of that for them was religious, but they justified it a lot of times through, the fact that they felt their culture was just legitimately better than those around them. Their legalism, their laws, their culture, their norms. And this is why, they Romanized everybody around them, because they thought they really had the best civilization out there. And I think this trend continues into the Eastern Roman Empire, because, of course, it's a direct continuation of the Roman Empire and into the Byzantine Empire. We have these different names for them, but at the end of the day, there's not clear cutoff points. It is a continuous line, even though, these empires change a lot over time. So I think this feeling of supremacy kind of can date back to the old ancient Roman era, but just new justifications are developed. And at this point, we're talking about a religious justification based on Christianity. So, yeah, I just think that's really fascinating.
And this is also reflected in Byzantine art. Due to itinerant Roman monks, this philosophy soon spread to outlying lands and allowed various Eastern European kings to unify their kingdoms. For example, Bulgaria in the early Middle Ages faced strife due to a dualist religious movement known as Bogomilism. This was a Christian heresy which saw the material world as sinful and regarded church authorities with contempt. The Bulgarian Empire thus promoted the theological supremacy of their leaders to suppress the movement, a doctrine learned from Eastern Roman religious philosophy. As the Eastern Romans pushed religious ambassadors into foreign lands, so too did foreigners flow into Constantinople. The wealth of the Byzantine Empire was something that drew many of the pagan Slavic, Vlach or Kartvelian peoples to the city of Constantinople. We have already discussed the appeal of Christianity to the medieval state of Kievan Rus in one of our previous episodes, whose Norse leaders saw it as the great city of Miklagard. Across medieval Eurasia, pagan peoples were not viewed favorably by many, so conversion to either Christianity or Islam allowed for better access to major Silk Road trade hubs, which were dominated by Islamic and Christian powers like the Caliphate, and of course Eastern Rome.
Yeah, we talk about different monarchs converting to, any religion, but in this instance we're talking about Christianity and then converting their people. Now, surely in some of those cases there was some legitimate religious conversion, aka a monarch converted to Christianity due to their belief that it was the true religion, but in a lot of cases there were clear political benefits to conversion, as I talked about earlier, and they're bringing up now. There are political benefits, economic benefits, for a lot of countries, a lot of states, it would allow them to better integrate with their neighbors, open up trade deals, open up better diplomacy. So, while some of these conversions were surely, based on, the legitimate feelings of the monarch, it's pretty easy to see that a lot of them had clear political motivations.
Byzantium, being at the nexus of Silk Road trade, made Christianization extremely tempting for many pagan peoples.
Yeah.
The prestige of Constantinople as a top travel destination amplified Byzantium's diplomatic power. When foreign dignitaries visited Constantinople, they were often treated with majestic receptions in places such as Hagia Sophia. This served to make foreign rulers want to emulate and be connected to a large and illustrious empire such as Byzantium.
Yeah, well, even though, we can see the decline of Byzantine power over the years, despite that, when visiting Constantinople, I think it still seems just as grand as it always had been. It was an extremely impressive place to visit, like the Hagia Sophia was an extremely impressive church. If you're a Christian, that's got to be a really, important thing to you. In addition, you could also see the remnants of the old Roman days. So you're sort of connecting to this impressive city of Christianity, this city which is an old Roman city. It's got a lot of history to it, a lot of meaning, and it was very impressive to foreign diplomats who visited. That alone can make a big impression on you and shape your view of the whole Byzantine Empire and its legacy.
A partnership which came with many benefits for the rulers and their subjects. Benefits like the aforementioned deployment of monks and scholars like Cyril and Methodius for local rulers to utilize, which provided the ability to build state and ecclesiastical apparatuses to unify their states. Marriage alliances were also common. Princesses like Simonida and Helena Palaia-Lohina, who married into Serbian and Muscovite royal families, or Anna Porphyroyanita, who married into the Kievan Rusi's princely house, played important roles as both diplomats and as cultural ambassadors. While not all of the members of the Byzantine Commonwealth were Orthodox, religion was one of the defining features of Byzantine-influenced nations.
Yeah.
Many of the kingdoms that received Eastern Rome, such as the Rus, Serbia, and Bulgaria, were linked via Byzantine Christianity.
I mean, Orthodox Christianity was probably the empire's biggest cultural export, because if you look at their culture, it was largely defined by, Christianity. I mean, and I've talked about, how that cultural supremacy may have come from earlier Roman trends and et cetera, but at this moment, Byzantine culture is so Christian. It's so focused around Eastern Orthodox Christianity that it makes sense that that would be their biggest cultural export.
This gave rise to the belief among Byzantine elites that their domain was not linked to the lands controlled by the Emperor of Constantinople, but stretched to wherever Orthodox Christians lived. However, despite this pan-religious camaraderie, discrimination still existed, with Slavic peoples often considered to be barbaric in language compared to the sophistication of Greeks. Byzantine statecraft often served as one of the models of ascendant empires. This usually meant the legal and cultural unification of the state under Orthodox-inspired emulation of Byzantium. For example, one of Bulgaria's most powerful monarchs, Simeon the Great, ushered a major era of cultural flourishing in the Bulgarian Empire. In fact, Simeon's reign is a testament to the fact that Byzantium was not the unquestioned leader in the Commonwealth. Simeon engaged in diplomatic and trade wars with Byzantium.
I think this is a very good point. I think that, the Byzantine Empire did always hold this sort of cultural supremacy that was hard to supersede, but, as we and you've kind of seen it on maps that have been shown throughout this video, at times, Bulgaria was probably just as powerful, if not more powerful in practical terms in comparison to the Byzantines. More militarily, economically powerful. The Bulgarian Empire was a real competitor to the Byzantine Empire. And so I think this is right. The Byzantines were not necessarily the unquestioned rulers of the region. In many ways, the Bulgarians at times had one up on them. Now, this was not always true, and this was a competition. And like I said, the Byzantines had, more of the history, legacy, and culture behind them. That's what we're talking about here. They had a lot of the soft power aspects, but Bulgaria was definitely a competitor.
And gained land from Byzantium, Hungary, and Serbia. Simeon was very successful in his military campaigns, breaking off Prince Tomislav of Croatia's links with Constantinople via treaty. Simeon also promoted Slavonic literature, particularly via the Ohrid and Preslav literary schools. It was in these schools that the Cyrillic alphabet was formalized, replacing the Glagolitic script previously used by the Slavs.
Yep.
As a result of this, Bulgaria became one of the bulwarks of Slavonic literature throughout the Slavic-speaking world. Another interesting part of the Byzantine Commonwealth is the legal influence Eastern Rome had on its cultural satellites. The Byzantines, long considered to be major legalists since the time of Justinian, were useful as models of building
And, where did they get that from? Well, from their Roman ancestors. I mean, the Roman Empire, back when it was based in Rome, was always famous for its legalism. They loved their laws. They needed laws for everything, rituals, all that kind of stuff. And that was a trend that continued to the Byzantines.
Unifying legal codes. In fact, Cyril and Methodius were some of the first writers of the Slavic Civil Code, a legal text harmonizing the laws of Moravia. Other figures, such as Sava the Illuminator of Serbia, merged local Serbian law and Byzantine law, forging a new legal code known as Zakono Pravilo. There is also the factor of monasteries and mystics, which often united the disparate parts of the Commonwealth via cultural and theological production. A major center of this was Mount Athos in modern-day Greece. Originally a monastic center, the Holy Mountain began to welcome many monastic complexes from throughout the Commonwealth, as well as Catholics. Throughout the late Middle Ages, these centers produced monks who went on to found monasteries throughout the region.
Yeah.
Graham Speake has termed this the Athonite Commonwealth. Figure
We're really using the term commonwealth pretty frequently, but I mean, that's exactly right. You know, monasteries and monks were a big influence during this era, and they were spread around throughout this whole region of, Eastern Europe, as we're calling it. And that would have been another big aspect of culture, Byzantine cultural export, Byzantine Christianity. So that is a very important thing to look at.
figures such as John the Iberian and Euthymius the Athonite, who hailed from Georgia, founded monasteries in the mountain and produced voluminous translations and scholarly texts. Through
And I mean, we see, if you're familiar with, let's say, like medieval or Dark Age history, a lot of the writing, bookkeeping, done in this era is done by, Catholic monks in the West. There are other institutions that do such things, particularly if we move back to Eastern Europe. There are other academic institutions or historical institutions, but similarly, monks, monasteries, and religious institutions were doing a lot of the writing, the history keeping, translating things, taking oral passages or oral histories or anything like that and actually writing them down. So they're responsible for a lot of the written work and literature of this era. So very important.
Through this, a common spiritual and philosophical network emerged, allowing for cultural bonds between the peoples of the Commonwealth. Sava the Illuminator, one of the most influential figures in early Serbian history, is also said to have come to the Holy Mountain many times to study and live an ascetic life. Upon his return to Serbia, he founded many bishoprics and monasteries precisely with the goal of Christianizing the whole of the country. His organizational and literary work was prolific and produced many great parts of Serbian classical literature. For this reason, after his death, Sava was made a saint, and his cultural legacy lasts in Serbia to this day.
Nice. And it is interesting how we're talking about sort of this Byzantine cultural sphere. But in the modern era, we see the development of modern nationalism and modern nation states. And a lot of these things, a lot of these people get reinterpreted as part of the nationalism and the national history of different states. So, Serbians or Bulgarians or, whatever country or group you want to talk about, take some of these figures and, morph their legacy into something specific to their country, even though that's not necessarily how it was seen beforehand. Now, I'm not saying if that's, correct or incorrect, legitimate or illegitimate. Of course, these people are a part of these different nations' history, but it is just interesting to see how modern nationalism shapes popular perception and the perception in the eyes of the people of many of these figures who beforehand were not necessarily seen as figures specific to one nation, but perhaps to a larger Orthodox culture or larger regional culture.
Beyond Athos, other monasteries throughout the Commonwealth often provided places for translation of Greek texts, such as the monasteries in Kiev. Another interesting consequence of the Byzantine Commonwealth is the adaptation of art and saintly cults in Eastern Europe. Byzantine art schools spread through the monasteries to the entire region, as did the cults of particularly popular saints. For example, military saints such as George, Demetrios, and Theodore were often highly regarded in Byzantium, especially after Byzantine wars with the Islamic caliphates. Their cults seem to have spread to the Rus, a state founded by warlike Vikings, in a very organic fashion. In the Rus, the saints were seen and depicted as primarily warriors. This means that they appealed to the Rus princes specifically for their military prowess, not necessarily their religious fervor.
And once again, we're seeing how these cultural exports, particularly in this case, Orthodox saints, Christian saints, can be interpreted and used differently based on where you look. So, the Kievan Rus are taking some of the more militaristic aspects because it's in line with their culture. What they already believe, their pre-existing beliefs. And so around this area, you have different peoples and different states who are taking, Byzantine culture, Byzantine ideas, and integrating it into what they already have. So it's a combination of, they're integrating this stuff into their own culture, but, still there is that Byzantine legacy and influence there.
The Catholic world was not passive to this Byzantine diplomatic and cultural network. We have already discussed the presence of Bavarian ecclesiastes in the Czech lands. Slowly and over time, the presence and reorganization of the church structure shifted the power towards the Archbishop of Mainz, tilting towards Catholicism later on.
Yep.
In the north, Catholicism spread through Poland, while various chivalric orders spread Catholicism amongst the pagan population in the Baltics.
And of course, over time, Catholic or Western Christian power would definitely increase in contrast to Eastern Christianity, which would decline to a certain extent, alongside the lengthy decline of the Byzantine Empire, whereas you look west and you have a lot of growing powerful states. The Catholic Church continues to get more powerful in the West, and so, the Western Christians, the Latin Christians, do expand their influence over time.
In the Crusades, various Catholic movements occurred throughout the Balkans, even in Byzantium itself after the Palaiologian Restoration. These changes often had geopolitical reasons, such as the Treaty of Florence or the Treaty of Nymphaeon. Tensions then rose between Moscow and Constantinople for this very reason, causing rifts by the 15th century. Diplomacy was also used by the Pope in Bulgaria and Armenia. The Pope utilized the animosity between Byzantium and Armenian Cilicia and provided the Armenian kings with titles. This was the beginning of the connections between Rome and Armenia that would give birth to Armenian Catholicism. In Bulgaria, the Pope gave the Tsars legitimacy via the donation of banners and re-sacralization of the Bulgarian kingship. Many churches and peoples would often choose one side or another for their own protection or for political ends. Some communities, such as the Maronites in modern-day Lebanon, accepted the primacy of the Pope.
And it's really interesting how you can see throughout this area and throughout the world, in the modern day, different communities, be Catholic, Orthodox, or whatever other religion, and you sometimes wonder, I wonder how they ended up like this. Why did they adopt Orthodox Christianity? And you can look back, and it's really fascinating because often it's a political or diplomatic event from 500, 600, 700 years ago that led to that change or the solidification of that religion. It's a very practical, real-world way for that to happen, especially when you look at certain communities and think, well, they must have been following this religion forever. Not necessarily. Sometimes all it takes is a simple diplomatic move, and there you go. So yeah, interesting.
This is actually a prelude to the appearance of many Eastern Catholic churches in the 15th to 16th century, which would be first used to bring Catholicism via Orthodox rites, and then be persecuted by Orthodox empires. However, the synodic system of Orthodox Christianity often allowed for empires to stay Orthodox and clash or change geopolitical camps, such as Byzantium's turn to the west during the Ottoman incursions.
Yep.
The attempts of Byzantium to restore communion with Rome produced many fractures with the other major center of the Orthodox world, Muscovite Russia. The continuous wars in the Balkans and the eventual Ottoman conquest produced many fractures with the other Balkan Orthodox countries. In addition, the autonomy of each state meant that each took their geopolitical and cultural interests first. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the Commonwealth as a concept can be said to have ended, with other Balkan Orthodox countries being conquered by the Ottomans a few years later. However, the rum millet of the Ottoman Empire and the appeals of the Russian Tsars as protectors of orthodoxy in the early modern period can be seen as descendants of the bonds of the Byzantine Commonwealth. The ecclesiastical artistic links of Eastern Europe are still evident in churches throughout the region. Each member of the Commonwealth acted as its own agent both during and after the Commonwealth's end, but the cultural developments and connections that were ushered by these networks, regardless of whether a country stayed with Constantinople or Rome, have built lasting links that survive to this day.
Very true.
More videos on Byzantine history are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them.
All right. That was a really interesting one. Like I said at the beginning, I find sort of the expression of soft power a really fascinating thing. And like they said, probably precisely because it's soft power and because of how the Ottomans operated, even after the Ottoman Empire taking over this region, the former territory of the Byzantine Empire, it's not like, a lot of this cultural influence from the Byzantines just disappeared. Sure, the Byzantine Empire was gone, but, a lot of that culture was still there, partially because, the Ottomans, their empire used a certain level of toleration, not what we would in the modern age call toleration, but toleration at the time, and that they couldn't be bothered converting everybody that they'd conquered. That would just be really impractical, and so they developed things like the Rum Millet, which is like the Roman Millet, which was basically sort of a semi-self-governing group within the Ottoman Empire that included the Orthodox members of the empire. And so you sort of see, that Orthodox culture continue following the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. And interestingly, it's called, the Rum Millet, Roman. So that shows us that there's clearly still a link back to the old Roman Empire, back when it was in Rome about, at that point, 1,000 years ago. So yeah, just a really fascinating video. It's really interesting to see these trends over time, the expansion of, Orthodox Christianity and Byzantine culture over time, and how you can still see a lot of those effects today, But you can also see how it changed over time. Like we said, following the collapse of Constantinople, I'd say the main inheritor of that Orthodox legacy was Moscow. And, following that, the growing Russian Empire over the next, 500 years, basically. They were the main inheritor of, that position at the top of Orthodox Christianity, and the Russian Empire would act as sort of the protector of Orthodox Christians throughout that region. So they sort of adopted that role. But yeah, a lot of fascinating stuff here. I could probably talk about this for hours. I'd be interested in other videos that sort of go over this stuff or stuff similar to this. If you guys enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.